When I came home from the hospital, my house wasn't there. Oh, the walls still stood, the garden still bloomed, but it was no longer mine. My own son had signed it away while I lay in a hospital bed, fighting for my life. I didn't shout. I didn't beg. I simply walked away. A year later, I returned, and I owned every house on that street, except his. I was never a rich man, at least not in the way the world counts wealth. I was a construction foreman for most of my life. My hands were my credentials, my back my degree. I built other men's dreams for a wage and, in the quiet hours after work, I built my own home brick by brick. Every nail I drove, every board I set, I placed with the certainty that it would outlast me. I was 29 when I broke ground on the house that would carry my name for more than 4 decades. I didn't hire architects or contractors. I had a set of weathered blueprints, a truck that coughed on cold mornings, and a mind stubborn enough to see it through. By day I worked on high-rises, office parks, and schools. By night I came home, changed my shirt, and kept building. The neighbors used to joke that I'd have it finished by the time my children were in college. They were wrong. I finished it the summer my son turned 3. That home was never just wood and stone to me. It was where I taught my boy to ride a bike in the driveway, where we roasted chestnuts in the fireplace in winter, where we sat on the porch in the quiet hours after supper and counted the evening stars. My wife used to say the walls were seasoned, every year adding another layer of warmth, another story in the grain. I raised my son with the same principles I had inherited from my father: work harder than you complain, take less than you deserve, and give more than you can spare. When he was little, he believed in those things as if they were commandments carved into stone. He would watch me repair a broken fence post or patch a leaky roof and say, "One day, I'll be just like you, Dad." I believed him. The years rolled on. I was proud of the man I thought he was becoming: educated, ambitious, full of confidence. I didn't have much to give him in the way of money, but I gave him the thing I valued most: a legacy of honesty. I thought that would be enough to keep him grounded. I thought that if you planted your values deep enough in a man, they'd hold him steady through any storm. Looking back now, I see how naive that was. But back then, I had no reason to doubt. He'd come by the house often, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with just an hour to sit and talk. He called me "old man" with a smile in his voice, never in malice. I didn't see the shadows gathering. I didn't notice the distance growing. I didn't yet understand that sometimes a man can teach his son everything he knows, and still lose him to something he never saw coming. That house was my proof that life, no matter how hard, could be built into something solid. I thought it was the one thing that could never be taken from me. I know better now. It's strange how distance doesn't always come in miles. Sometimes it arrives in the way a person looks at you, or doesn't. When my son married, I was happy for him. She was a pretty woman, confident in a way that filled every room she walked into. But from the start, I could sense something behind her smiles, like she was measuring me against some invisible ruler and finding me short. She never said anything outright. It was in small things, the way she'd wrinkle her nose at the old coffee mugs I'd had for 20 years, or how she'd compliment the quaint kitchen I built with my own hands. She'd tell stories about her father, a lawyer with a vacation home, and then glance around my modest living room as if it were a museum exhibit from a poorer time. At first, I told myself I was being too sensitive. Newlyweds need space, I thought. They have their own life now, their own rhythm. But the visits grew less frequent, and the calls grew shorter. When they did come, my son seemed different. He dressed sharper, talked faster, always checking his phone. I used to be the man he came to for advice on everything from car trouble to how to hang a door straight. Now, he'd brush me off with, "Don't worry about it, Dad, I've got it covered." The dinners stopped. At first, they'd come over once or twice a month. Then it was holidays only. Then even those felt rushed, like they were squeezing me into an overstuffed calendar. I remember one evening in particular. I'd been working in the garden all day, planting tomatoes. My knees were stiff, my back sore, but I had a good feeling about that soil. I thought I'd invite them over, maybe grill some steaks, share a bottle of wine I'd been saving. I called my son, and he answered with that hurried tone that tells you're an interruption. "We can't tonight, Dad. We've got plans. Maybe next week." The next week never came. I tried to be understanding. People grow, they change. But I couldn't ignore the way he'd started to talk about real money and making smart moves, as if the life I had built, slow, steady, paid for in full, was some kind of outdated mistake. I noticed, too, that my daughter-in-law spoke more and more about future plans that didn't seem to include me. They'd mentioned selling their condo, moving up to a bigger place. She'd joke about how old houses are a money pit, and my son would laugh along. I would smile politely, even when it felt like they were laughing at me, or worse, at the life I'd worked so hard to build. It's a peculiar kind of hurt, watching your own child drift from you. Not because of something you did wrong, but because of something you can't quite name. I told myself it was just the natural course of things. I told myself not to cling. But deep down, I felt the foundation shifting. Looking back, that was when the house stopped being just mine. Not legally, not yet, but in spirit. They had already started imagining a future where I wasn't in it. I didn't know it then, but the first cracks in our closeness had already split wide open. All it would take was time, and the right opportunity. The morning I turned 70 was quiet. Too quiet. I woke before the sun, as I always did, and made myself coffee in the old percolator. The kitchen smelled the same as it had for 40 years, warm, earthy, familiar. I sat at the table with my cup, waiting for the phone to ring. It didn't. In the past, birthdays had been noisy affairs. My late wife would bake a cake from scratch, the kind with frosting you could smell from the driveway. My son, even as a grown man, would show up with a gift wrapped in yesterday's newspaper and a sheepish grin, claiming he'd forgotten to buy proper wrapping paper. Friends and neighbors would drop by with cards, bottles of wine, or just their company. The day would stretch late into the night, laughter carrying out into the garden. But that morning, the silence felt heavy. By 10 o'clock, I told myself they were just busy. By noon, I told myself they were planning a surprise. By mid-afternoon, I stopped pretending. I took a slow walk into town. Bought myself a sandwich from the deli and sat on a bench by the park. Watched children run across the grass, their parents calling after them with the easy joy that comes from thinking these moments will last forever. I wondered if my son would think back on me the same way, or at all. It wasn't about the cake, or the presents, or even the company. It was about the simple acknowledgement that I was still here, still worth remembering. 70 years of living, working, raising a family, and the people I'd given most of my life to couldn't spare a call. That night, I made myself a small dinner, chicken and potatoes, and ate at the same kitchen table where we'd once celebrated everything from graduations to Christmas mornings. The chair across from me stayed empty. When I finally checked my phone before bed, there was no message. No missed call. Not even a text. My son had forgotten my birthday. Or maybe he hadn't forgotten. Maybe he'd just chosen not to remember. I went to bed without turning on the television. Laying there in the dark, I thought about the years I'd spent teaching him to be the kind of man who honored his word and valued his people. And I wondered if those lessons had simply washed away, like chalk in the rain. It was a small wound, but it cut deep. And like most wounds of the heart, it wouldn't heal the way it should. It would fester, and it would stay. I didn't know it yet, but that forgotten birthday was the first time I felt something inside me shift, from hope to doubt. It was the second week of my hospital stay when I first heard her voice. Not the nurse, I knew her tone well by then, but my daughter-in-law's. I was half asleep, drifting in and out, when she spoke just outside my door. Yes, he's still here. They're saying another week at least. So, how soon can we get the paperwork ready? There was a pause. The nurse's shoes squeaked faintly against the linoleum as she shifted her weight. My daughter-in-law's voice dropped lower, but in a quiet hospital hallway, a whisper travels further than people think. He's not well enough to handle all this, so we'll need to expedite. My husband has power of attorney, so there shouldn't be an issue. We just need to get the signatures in place before he's discharged. I kept my eyes closed. My heart didn't race, it sank. There's a difference. Racing means there's hope, that you're still trying to make sense of something. Sinking means you already understand. They didn't know I'd heard. The conversation ended quickly, with polite goodbyes, and the footsteps faded down the hall. When the nurse came in later to check my blood pressure, I said nothing. Not because I was too weak to speak, but because I knew my words would be wasted. A man learns, with age, that there's a certain power in silence. When someone believes you're in the dark, they get bold. They act without caution. And when the truth finally steps into the light, their surprise is your advantage. Later that week, a piece of mail arrived from my bank, forwarded to the hospital by a neighbor who'd been collecting it for me. I opened it to find statements I didn't recognize, a mortgage where there shouldn't have been one, withdrawal that I hadn't made. I read it twice, 3 times, feeling the slow burn of realization take hold. I thought of the home I had built, every beam and nail placed by my own hands. I thought of the afternoons spent teaching my boy how to measure twice and cut once. I thought of my wife's voice in the kitchen, of her telling me, "This house will always be your anchor." And now, my own blood was trying to lift that anchor and set it adrift. I didn't confront him. Not then. The old me, the man I'd been most of my life, might have stormed into his office, slammed the papers on his desk, and demanded answers. But I wasn't that man anymore. I was older, slower, and, perhaps wiser. I knew enough to recognize when a storm was coming. And I had no intention of being caught in it without a plan. So I let them think I was unaware. I smiled when they visited. I thanked them for bringing me magazines, for adjusting my pillows. I nodded politely when they spoke about future plans, as though I were just another bystander to my own life. All the while, I listened. I remembered. And I waited. Because I knew, without question, that when a person shows you what they're capable of, you don't ignore it. You prepare for the day they try again. The day I left the hospital, the air felt different. Sharper. I stepped out into sunlight that should have felt like freedom, but instead, it felt like a warning. A friend drove me home, or what I thought was still my home. We turned onto my street, and something in my gut tightened. My truck wasn't in the driveway. My rose bushes, the ones I'd tended for decades, had been dug out. The front lawn was trimmed too neat, too precise, not the way I kept it. When we pulled up, I saw it. A brand new lock on my door. I got out slowly, leaning on my cane, and tried the handle. Nothing. I knocked once, twice. My son opened it, his face a mixture of irritation and surprise, like I'd arrived uninvited. "Dad, you weren't supposed to come straight here," he said. "And why's that?" I asked, my voice low, even. He glanced over his shoulder, then stepped outside and closed the door behind him. "Look, we've moved some of your things into storage. The house, well, it's not really yours anymore. It made sense to transfer ownership. You weren't in a position to handle the upkeep, and this way it stays in the family." I stared at him. The words, "not really yours," hung in the air like a stench. "You sold my house while I was in the hospital." It wasn't a question. He shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't sell it. We refinanced and moved the deed, that's all. It's better this way. More practical. You'll thank me later." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't curse. I didn't even ask him why he thought he had the right. I simply looked at my son, the boy I'd raised, the man I thought I knew, and realized I didn't recognize him anymore. Behind him, through the crack in the door, I could see strangers' shoes lined up in the entryway. My home wasn't just taken. It had already been claimed. He kept talking, explaining something about market value and financial stability, but I'd stopped listening. My cane felt heavier in my hand, my breath slower. There are moments in a man's life when he knows the ground has shifted under him, and there's no going back. This was mine. When he was finished, I nodded once. I see. Then I turned, walked down the path, and got back into my friend's car. I didn't ask for a single box from storage. I didn't ask where I was supposed to go. In that moment, I understood something with perfect clarity: if I stayed and fought him on his terms, I would lose. Not because I was wrong, but because I'd be fighting in the open, where he expected me to. No. I would leave quietly. And when I came back, it wouldn't be to ask for my house. It would be to make sure he could never take from me again. That was the day the man he'd known as his father, patient, forgiving, predictable, died. What remained was someone he wouldn't see coming. If your child did this to you, would you still call them family? I rented a small apartment on the edge of town. Nothing fancy, one bedroom, creaking floors, a view of the alley. The kind of place a younger man might see as a step down. But I wasn't thinking about steps up or down. I was thinking about staying still. The first weeks were quiet. Too quiet, some would say. I didn't watch television much. I'd sit at the small table by the window, drinking coffee and looking out over the narrow street, listening to the hum of a world that went on whether I was ready for it or not. I didn't call my son. He didn't call me. And in that silence, I began to hear myself again. At the grocery store, I moved slowly, not because I had to, but because I could. I noticed the way the price of bread had climbed, the way young couples argued over small things in the aisles. I noticed that I wasn't angry anymore, not in the shouting, breaking things sense. The anger had cooled into something heavier, more solid. In the afternoons, I'd take walks through my old neighborhood. I never stopped in front of my house. I'd walk the block instead, looking at the other properties, taking note of which ones had "for sale" signs, which ones had peeling paint, which owners were older and might be ready to move on. I didn't yet know what I'd do with that information, but I kept it all the same. One day, I ran into an old friend, a retired surveyor. We talked about the changes in town, who'd sold their homes, which developers were sniffing around. He told me property was moving faster than it used to, but not so fast that a man with patience couldn't take advantage. I listened without saying much. The thing about silence is that it gives you room to think. And in those weeks, I thought about my life in a way I never had before. I'd always been a builder, of homes, of routines, of relationships. But maybe it was time to build something different. Something that couldn't be taken by a forged signature or a smile with teeth behind it. I stopped walking past my house. I stopped wondering what was happening inside those walls. Instead, I began to imagine a longer game, one that didn't end with me getting the house back. No, I was done chasing what was mine. I would create something bigger. I spent my evenings going through the local paper, marking the real estate listings. I learned which banks were holding foreclosures, which landlords were looking to sell. I called no one. I told no one. I just listened, read, and waited. The silence became my ally. It hid my intentions. It gave me time to plan without interference. And though I hadn't yet made my first move, I knew, with the same certainty I'd had the day I first drove a nail into the frame of my old house, that when I did, it would be the beginning of something my son would never see coming. It started with a yellow legal pad and a pen. I've always believed a man should see his plans in ink before he moves a muscle. That night, I drew 3 columns: address, owner, price. Then I opened the stack of local papers I'd been keeping and started filling in the blanks. The first property I wrote down was 2 streets over from my old house, a weathered duplex with a sagging porch and an owner I knew was tired of tenants. Then came a foreclosed bungalow at the end of a cul-de-sac. Then a vacant lot where the weeds had grown taller than the fence. One by one, I listed them, not for their beauty or condition, but for their potential. I didn't have the kind of cash to buy them all outright, not yet. But I had something just as valuable: time, patience, and a lifetime of contacts from the construction trade. I called an old friend, Marty, who'd retired from the hardware business but still knew every contractor and tradesman in the county. Over coffee, I told him I was looking for projects, places nobody else wanted. I didn't mention why. Marty didn't ask. That's the thing about old friends, they know when not to press. From there, it became a routine. I'd spend my mornings walking the neighborhoods, my afternoons meeting with small-time owners, and my evenings on the phone with the bank. I didn't compete with developers, I moved in the spaces they ignored. The houses I bought weren't the kind you flipped for quick profit. They were the kind you held onto, the kind that built roots under your feet. The first deal was the duplex. The owner was glad to be rid of it, and I was glad to take it off his hands. I paid cash for half the price by dipping into savings I'd been keeping for emergencies. If losing my home didn't qualify, I don't know what did. I put a quiet tenant in there, a widower like me, the sort of man who paid on time and didn't cause trouble. The rent covered the property taxes and left a little extra each month. Then came the bungalow. It needed more work, but that was my language. I fixed the roof myself, slow but steady, and hired a young man from the neighborhood to paint the place. I paid him fair, and he worked twice as hard because no one else had ever treated him like a craftsman instead of cheap labor. Each purchase brought me closer to something I hadn't felt since before the hospital: control. Not the loud kind you wave in someone's face, but the quiet kind that moves unseen until it's too late to stop. And I kept my focus narrow. Every property I bought was within 3 blocks of my old house. Not because I wanted to live there again, no, that door had closed, but because I understood the value of proximity. Influence starts small. A single street can change a life. My son still didn't know. If he noticed anything, he must have thought it was coincidence. That was fine by me. I wanted him unprepared. By the end of the year, my yellow legal pad was full of crossed-out addresses, each one a small victory. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge is hot and quick, it burns out. This was something colder, something steadier. I wasn't looking to take from him. I was building a world where he simply didn't matter. The change didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about a slow hand, it looks like nothing's moving until you realize the whole picture's shifted. By the second year, I held the deeds to 7 properties on my old street and 3 more within shouting distance. A pair of duplexes, 4 single-family homes, 2 empty lots, and a corner house that used to be the neighborhood eyesore until I gave it a fresh coat of paint and a new roof. I didn't flash my ownership around. The names on the paperwork belonged to a quiet little LLC I'd set up through a lawyer who understood the value of confidentiality. To the public, it was just another small rental outfit, nothing special. But I knew every nail, every tenant, every blade of grass was under my watch. I kept the rents fair, lower than the big management companies. That meant my tenants stayed, paid on time, and respected the places they lived in. And in return, I had a loyal circle of people who kept me informed about the street's rhythm. If a house went up for sale, I knew before the sign hit the ground. It was almost amusing, watching my son come and go from what he thought was his street, unaware that nearly every property around him answered to me. He'd wave to a neighbor, not knowing that neighbor was my tenant. He'd complain about parking or noise, not realizing I had the authority to change it overnight. The crown jewel came one October afternoon, a triplex 2 doors down from my old house. The owner, a retired teacher, was moving to be closer to her daughter. She wanted a clean sale, someone who wouldn't tear the place down. I signed the papers the same week. By then, the neighborhood had begun to take on my shape. Lawns were kept, paint was fresh, porches swept. People stopped locking themselves away and started talking over fences again. It was as if I was quietly undoing the neglect my son had allowed to take root. And still, he didn't know. It wasn't until I bought the vacant lot right across from his driveway that I felt the weight of what I'd built. That patch of dirt was more than land, it was a statement. I could have left it empty, but instead, I had it cleaned, fenced, and turned into a small community garden for the tenants. From his front window, he'd watch neighbors planting tomatoes and sunflowers where weeds had once stood. He couldn't have missed the change, but he didn't yet understand whose hand had guided it. That was the beauty of the unseen strike. You don't hit hard, you hit consistently, until the person realizes they've been surrounded the whole time. By the end of that year, I no longer walked the street like a visitor. I walked it like a man inspecting his work, quiet, thorough, satisfied. My son still had his house, yes. But it sat like an island in a sea that belonged to me. And I wasn't finished. Not yet. It happened on a Sunday. The air had that early spring smell, damp earth, faint blossoms, a touch of cool wind off the hills. I was walking the street as I often did, checking the properties, speaking with a tenant about a leaky gutter, when I saw him. My son was standing at the end of his driveway, arms crossed, looking right at me. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then he started walking toward me with a kind of stiffness I recognized, the walk of a man who's come to pick a fight he's sure he'll win. "We need to talk," he said. His voice wasn't a request. I nodded. "All right." We stood there on the sidewalk, the garden across the street in full view, the one I'd put in. People were planting beans and lettuce, their laughter carrying between us. "Why are you buying up all these houses?" he asked. "I've been hearing your name from half the block." I let the question hang for a moment. Then I said, "Because I can." His jaw tightened. "You're doing this to get back at me." "No," I said quietly. "If I wanted to get back at you, I'd have taken your house. I could have, you know. More than once. But I don't want it." "Then what do you want?" he demanded. I looked past him, at the roofline I'd built all those years ago, still standing straight. "I want to know that the street I worked for, the place I built with my hands, isn't rotting from the inside. That's all." He laughed, short, bitter. "You think you're the savior of this neighborhood? You're just making it harder for us to live here. Property values are going up because of you." "Yes," I said. "They are." That stopped him for a beat. He looked at me like I was speaking another language. "You can't control everything," he said finally. "I don't need to control everything," I replied. "Just enough to make sure you understand something you should have learned a long time ago: this place isn't yours just because you say it is. You didn't earn it, and you didn't respect it. And now, you live in a neighborhood that belongs to me." His face flushed, the way it used to when he was a boy caught in a lie. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out at first. "You've been planning this since?" His eyes narrowed. "Since the hospital." I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The silence between us told him all he needed to know. The garden laughter grew louder. A couple of my tenants waved as they passed, calling my name. I waved back. My son noticed. His shoulders sank just a little. "You think this makes you better than me?" he said. "No," I told him. "It makes me prepared. That's all." I turned then, not waiting for him to respond, and kept walking down the street I owned. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The sound of his stillness behind me was enough. "Would you have stayed silent?" or screamed like they did. In the days after that Sunday, the air on the street felt different. Not to everyone, life still carried on for most, but between my son and me, something had shifted into the open. I didn't see him for a while after that. He stopped lingering in his yard, stopped waving at passing cars. I'd catch sight of him sometimes through the front window, standing with his phone in his hand, looking out at the garden across the street. But he never came over. It was the neighbors who felt the change first. They weren't fools. Word had been traveling for months about the quiet man buying up houses on this block. Some thought it was a corporation, others, a distant investor. When they learned it was me, their reaction split right down the middle, gratitude from those who liked the way the street was improving, suspicion from those who feared what ownership might mean. I made it a point to be seen without flaunting anything. If a tenant had a broken fence, I'd fix it myself. If the garden needed more soil, I brought it. I didn't tell anyone my reasons. The less people knew about the history between me and my son, the better. This was about business, not gossip. But he must have told someone, because soon enough, I began to notice the way certain neighbors glanced between us, as if measuring how deep the rift went. Then came the whispers. A friend at City Hall told me my son had been asking about zoning changes, property taxes, anything he could use to make my ownership more complicated. It was a desperate move, and one that showed me he'd finally understood I wasn't going anywhere. I could have confronted him again. Instead, I did nothing. That's the thing about letting someone stew in their own frustration, they'll cook themselves better than you ever could. One afternoon, I stopped by the corner duplex to replace a cracked step. As I worked, I overheard two neighbors talking about how much safer the street felt lately. Fewer loud parties, no abandoned cars sitting for weeks, yards looking better. They didn't know it was all by design. That was fine. Real change doesn't need a name attached to it to be real. Meanwhile, my son's life began to look smaller. His circle of friends seemed to shrink, fewer people stopping by his house. Maybe they didn't like the tension in the air. Or maybe they just didn't see him the way they once did, now that the truth was floating around. The silence between us stayed. I wasn't looking for reconciliation. This wasn't about mending fences, it was about making sure the land I'd worked for, the street I'd built a life on, was in steady hands. And if that meant he had to live inside a map I controlled, so be it. The old me might have felt guilt over that. This me? I slept just fine. Because here's the thing, some storms pass quickly. Others settle in, change the landscape, and make sure nothing grows the same way again. And this one had just begun. It was late summer when he finally knocked on my door. Not his wife. Not a letter. Him. I opened it to find my son standing there with the same posture he'd had as a teenager caught breaking curfew, head tilted down just enough to look sorry, eyes darting up to check my reaction. He was holding nothing. No flowers, no bottle of whiskey, no sign this was anything more than a conversation he'd been pressured into having. "Can I come in?" he asked. I stepped aside without a word. We sat at the kitchen table, the same kind I'd once eaten family dinners around, though in a different house now. He cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about what happened. I might have gone about things the wrong way." I didn't respond. He took that as permission to continue. "It wasn't personal. We just thought, I thought, it was the best decision for everyone. You were in the hospital, and we didn't know how long you'd be there. I figured it was better to make sure the house was taken care of." I let the words sit there between us. An explanation, but not an apology. A justification dressed up to look like concern. Finally, I asked, "Did you ever think to ask me what I wanted?" He hesitated. "I didn't think it would matter." "You were inconvenient?" I finished for him. He winced. "No. Just vulnerable." We needed to act fast. I looked at him then, really looked. This wasn't the boy I'd raised. This was a man who'd learned how to package his self-interest in polite language. I wondered if he even believed himself anymore, or if he knew exactly what he'd done and was hoping time had dulled the edge. "I hear you," I said, keeping my voice even. "But hearing you doesn't mean I agree. Or forgive." He shifted in his seat. "Dad, I'm not asking for, I just think we can move past this. Things don't have to stay like they are." I almost laughed. Like they are. As if this distance was some kind of weather pattern we could just wait out. "I've moved past it," I said finally. "But not in the way you think." His brow furrowed. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means," I said, leaning back, "I've built something now that doesn't include you. And it never will again." Silence stretched between us. He opened his mouth, closed it, then stood up. He left without shaking my hand, without looking back. When the door shut, I sat there for a while, staring at the empty chair. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel loss. I felt settled. Because a weak apology isn't an attempt to right a wrong, it's an attempt to make the wrong more comfortable to live with. And I wasn't interested in comfort. I was interested in clarity. The decision came to me one night in early autumn. I'd been sitting at my desk, going over rent receipts, when I realized that all this, the properties, the improvements, the steady flow of income, would outlive me. And if I left the papers untouched, the law would put it all into the hands of the very man who'd tried to take my first home from under me. No. That wouldn't happen. The next morning, I called my lawyer. Not the one I'd used in the past, but a new man, younger, sharp-eyed, the kind who asks few questions and listens more than he speaks. We met in his office, a small space lined with law books and smelling faintly of cedar. "I want to rewrite my will," I told him. "Everything. Start from zero." He nodded, pulled out a fresh folder, and began taking notes. I told him exactly how it was to be done. My son's name, and by extension, his wife's, would not appear anywhere. No legal loopholes, no accidental inheritances through marriage. Every property I owned would pass into a trust, the income from which would fund a local youth trade scholarship, for kids who wanted to work with their hands, just as I had. 2 properties would go to Marty, the old hardware man who'd helped me get started. Another to the young painter I'd hired to work on the bungalow, who'd shown more respect for his craft than my own blood had for me. The rest would remain under the trust's management, to keep the rents fair and the homes cared for. My instructions were clear: never sell to corporate landlords, never raise rents beyond reason, and always maintain the garden across from my son's house, not out of spite, but because that soil had become a symbol of what could grow when the right hands tended it. The lawyer asked once if I was sure about cutting my son out completely. I told him I was beyond sure. "You can't disinherit a man from something he never valued in the first place," I said. We signed the paperwork 2 weeks later. I walked out of that office lighter than I'd felt in years. Not happy, happiness wasn't the point, but certain. I knew my son would find out someday. Maybe through a public record, maybe when the will was read after I was gone. And when he did, he'd realize that what he tried to take with one bold move, I'd replaced with something he could never touch. That night, I filed the new will in my safe, alongside the deeds, the keys, and a single photograph of my old house, the way it looked before everything changed. I didn't keep the picture for sentiment. I kept it as proof. Proof that I'd once believed a home was a thing you could give freely to family, before I learned some lessons you only learn the hard way. When the last of the legal work was done, I felt no need to look back. I'd spent enough years circling the same street, enough nights thinking about walls that no longer belonged to me. It was time to plant myself somewhere new. I found a modest place by the lake, 1 story, wide porch, the kind of view that changes by the hour as the light shifts over the water. It wasn't grand, but it was mine in every sense that mattered. No one had touched it but me. The mornings became my favorite part of the day. I'd rise before the sun, make coffee in the quiet, and sit out on the porch as the mist lifted off the lake. Sometimes a heron would land on the far shore, its stillness mirroring my own. I didn't need the noise of a city, or the constant hum of neighborhood gossip. Here, the only voices were the wind in the trees and the water against the shore. I kept working on the properties, of course, but from a distance now. Marty handled the tenants, the painter took care of the maintenance crew. I still owned the whole operation, but it no longer owned me. In the afternoons, I'd drive into the small town nearby, buy fresh bread from the bakery, maybe a cut of meat from the butcher. I made friends there, the kind of people who didn't ask much about your past, only about whether you'd be coming to the Saturday fish fry. Once a month, I'd host a dinner for the handful of old friends I'd kept over the years. We'd eat, tell the same stories we'd told a dozen times before, and laugh in that easy way you can only laugh with people who know the worst and best of you. There was no bitterness in those gatherings, no talk of my son or the street I'd left behind. I didn't need to remind myself of what I'd lost, I was too busy living what I'd chosen. And that was the difference. The life I had before was something I'd built for others, for my wife, my son, the family I thought would carry it forward. This life was built for me. Not selfishly, not in anger, but in the simple recognition that a man has only so many years, and he ought to spend them where he's wanted. Sometimes, in the still of evening, I'd think about the garden across from my old house. I knew it was still there, well tended by the tenants, bright with tomatoes and sunflowers. I like to imagine my son looking out his window at it, feeling that quiet reminder of me every single day. Not because I wanted him to feel guilty, but because I wanted him to understand, you can take a man's house, but you can't take the ground he's willing to rebuild on. Would you start over, or keep trying with the ones who broke you? I've heard it said that peace comes when you forgive. I don't believe that. Peace, at least the kind I've found, comes when you understand, when you stop asking why someone wronged you and start accepting that it doesn't matter. The lake has a way of teaching you that. Some mornings the water is glass, still enough to see every ripple of the clouds above. Other days it's rough and restless, wind tearing at its surface. But either way, it remains the same lake. It doesn't apologize for the storms, and it doesn't explain the calm. It just is. I've stopped trying to make sense of my son's choices. Once, I thought there had to be an answer, some single moment I could point to, where we went from father and son to strangers in the same bloodline. Now, I see it differently. A man's character isn't built in moments, it's revealed in them. And the day I came home from the hospital, I saw his, plain as day. Do I wish it had been different? Of course. But wishing is a young man's sport. At my age, you trade wishing for building, not homes anymore, but the life you choose to live inside. My life now is simple. A porch. A stretch of water. A circle of friends who value my company, not my deeds. I still keep a watchful hand on the properties, not out of spite, but because I believe in leaving something better than you found it. That, I suppose, is my version of forgiveness, not for him, but for myself. Sometimes I get letters from tenants, small notes of thanks for keeping their rent fair, or for fixing something without delay. I keep those in a drawer. They remind me that the work I've done since losing my house hasn't just been about reclaiming pride, it's been about building something that matters to people who do appreciate it. I don't know what will happen after I'm gone. My will is in place, my instructions clear, but life has a way of testing even the best laid plans. Still, I'm at peace knowing I've done what I could to keep my legacy intact, even if my own son has no part in it. And that's the truth of it, peace isn't always about mending what's broken. Sometimes, it's about accepting that some things stay broken, and finding a way to live well in spite of that. A man's home is more than walls and wood. It's the life he builds inside it, the principles he nails into place. My first home was stolen, yes, but my ground, the ground of who I am, remained mine. And I will leave this life with that ground still under my feet.